Good morning.
Good morning.
So I know everyone has their own way with the heat, but I would like to encourage you to be embraced by it. It has its own function, and going through a period in the year where it gets very hot from like a cyclical standpoint is really important for your material body, but also other layers of your body. Emotional body, like what kind of feelings you have when it's hot that you might not have other times, what kind of thoughts, all those things are really important, and we tend to come across the heat or something like that. It's like, oh my gosh, it's going to be over 100, and we become very adept at kind of turning off the experience with various machines. But it's good to the degree that it is good. So I'm not trying to force you into the sweat lodge. God has done that. That's not my fault. Just spending some time with it. Like in Chinese medicine, they talk a lot about how this kind of cold that builds up in your body, or in some, the way I tend to think of it is water. There's a kind of certain watery quality that builds up, and it takes a good amount of heat to cook that out of your body. Not that it's an evil thing, it just becomes excessive. And then, and this kind of cycle of the balance where you go through a period where it gets hot. Also, it's just, the fall is so much better when the summer has been hot. Like you get some good heat, and then as it starts to cool down, there's this different quality. The leaves are different. It's a whole thing. Anyway, I'll stop preaching about that. But please appreciate the heat and find ways to work with it. So I'd like to continue today talking about the 6 perfections. And what I labeled for this series of talks as an ancient and practical liberation. That there is this way, which was presented by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, was written down at the earliest time that any teachings were written down. So for the first several hundred years, there was an oral tradition. And then once they hit the phase in Buddhism where those teachings were being written down, some of the first teachings to be written down, at least that we understand from a historical perspective, were these teachings about the 6 perfections, or the 6 crossing overs. I always say, I don't particularly like the translation of perfection, but it's the standard translation, so it's good to use, because if you're looking at Buddhist texts in English, that's the word that will almost always be used. But perfection here, you have to try to unhook from this kind of tight Puritan idea about perfection, and think about perfection as being this transformation, like the totality of transformation is what's meant here by perfection, to completely transform the living that is marked by samsara, or cyclical existence, which is also marked by suffering, into liberation. And that's what these are about. The 6 perfections are about that kind of journey, which isn't just getting somewhere, but it's about this whole process. It's about a path. And talked quite a bit in the past few weeks about how these 6 perfections are all animated by the 6th perfection. So the first 5 are generosity. We've talked a lot about that. And the second is, we use a broad term, ethics. I'm going to talk about that today. The next one, we talk about patience, or I prefer the word forbearance. So it's got a little more teeth. And vigor, or zeal, sometimes is translated that way. And then meditation. Those are the first 5, or concentration. And then the 6th is wisdom. So all 5 of these first kind of practices are all animated by, or they're made into a transformative practice by the 6th perfection, which is the perfection of wisdom. And that's why these teachings come about from a body of Buddhist teachings called the perfection of wisdom teachings. When we chant every Sunday morning, we chant the Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra. Perfect wisdom, it's the 6th perfection, and it's a sutra about the heart of that teaching of wisdom, or prajna as it's known in the Sanskrit. So that's what we're studying. Okay, some people have been here a bit, some people haven't been here for a bit, so kind of getting us into context. And as we've been focusing on this core teaching of wisdom, or prajna, the perfection of wisdom, prajna paramita, we've been emphasizing this teaching of emptiness, or shunyata is what it's called in Sanskrit. And I've been referencing that first, right there at the front of the Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra, that starts out with Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing prajna paramita, perfect wisdom, sixth of the perfections, clearly saw that all five aggregates are empty, and thus relieved all suffering, thus transformed a life of suffering into a life of ease and clarity. So this clear seeing is what we've been spending most of our time talking about. So I was making my notes this morning, and I was going over this English translation of the Heart Sutra in my head. I was like, Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing prajna paramita, clearly saw that. What an awful word. That all five aggregates are empty. That's what was going on in my head, just sharing what was going on in my head. The word that, this is kind of a stumbling block. It's not there in the Chinese. It's a English operation that we use to try to express things. But that is a declarative marker. So we're going to now say all things are something, right? Saw that all five aggregates are empty. Or we could just say all things are empty, right? So feel the distance in that, right? Avalokitesvara clearly saw that all those things are that way, right? I would prefer if the translation said something like, Avalokitesvara, when clearly seeing through emptiness, that kind of way. Not seeing that they are empty, because that's still so stuck in this subject-object thing, and now you're labeling, you're putting a quality upon objects, right? And I think that's one of the places we get stuck a lot with emptiness. We think like, it means everything's meaningless. It doesn't mean that. It just means everything isn't, which is different than meaningless. It just isn't solid in the way that you think that it's solid. And the focus that we're trying to come to here is not the attributes of those things, but that phenomena, whatever they are arising with you involved. So whatever it is that you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think, feel, whatever list you want to have, whatever it is, all of those things are not arising interdependently from you. They're not things out there. They're phenomena in which you're completely participating in them. And that's what the teachings of emptiness are about. Not to just make things solid, to try to soften the way that we just make things into objects, including ourselves. Okay, that's a little bit of a tangent, but important. And so these five flavors of emptiness that we've been focusing on, one, that the glass is already broken, things are already broken, they're not what we think they are, and they will come and go. And very emphasized in Buddhism. Sometimes gives Buddhism the rap of being very negative, right? The second one, that all things are interdependent, that nothing exists on its own. Whatever phenomena we experience, whether we can locate it as an object outside of ourselves, or a feeling, or a mirage, whatever it is, it's all coming from a big group of experiences, or a big group of things that are all appearing as that experience. The third thing, that I'm completely involved. There's no place to stand. I'm not standing over here and just seeing that something's interdependent. My seeing it is part of the interdependence of that phenomena. I'm not divorced from it. And then the fourth one, that everything is just exactly as it is. Or through the seeing, the clear seeing of emptiness, each phenomena does not need to move or be destroyed or gotten out of the way. And then the fifth one is this direct encounter, that there's a way in which emptiness animates a true, honest meeting between phenomena, or we could say between beings. Okay, so those are the five. I'm just laying them out because we're going over them again and again. So, we talked a lot about generosity, and last week I was making the point that generosity is wonderful. It has lots of opening type qualities to it. A lot of feelings of openness. When you can give a gift without being too caught up in who's giving the gift, who's receiving the gift, and what the results of the gift will be, there's this magic that happens. It's like parts of your being get unlocked. I'm sure you've experienced this before. That's both when it seems like you're giving the gift, or it seems like you're receiving the gift. In both those cases, a true gift has this capacity to open up all these parts of ourselves. And so I think it's really significant that the next in the list is ethics, because usually at least the very front door of ethics is exactly the opposite. It's shut it down, not open it up, all right? It has an opposite kind of quality. Now we just say ethics here is a translation of the term sila, which is one of the foundational practices, and it has a very broad meaning. So there is something like a positive ethic. There is, all kinds of ways we can think about ethics that isn't just in the negative, like don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But is also a flavor of ethics, which is don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And that's what I want to talk about today, that kind of stopping is really important. When we realize, oh, I'm open to something which I probably should stop being open to. There's a pattern of behavior, pattern of thinking, pattern of speaking, which is unskillful. It's causing suffering. And I need to do something with that. And Buddhism has lots and lots of different lists of things you shouldn't do. And different traditions take them up in different ways. But there is always this emphasis on these are things which you should stop. These are things you should stop. Now, when we think about stopping, I think that particularly in a kind of particular milieu that we live in right now, maybe a time and place that we're in now, a lot of conventional morality, which had a lot of problems with it, a lot of energy was put into trying to break that open a little bit. It itself had so much unskillful qualities to it. And so if you think about what's happened over the past 30, 40, 50 years within North American culture, kind of writ large anyway, there has been this big shift in morality, and which I personally think much of which is very healthy, right? But there also has been this kind of residual flavor of not liking the no's, like thinking where there's a line is drawn as kind of a hang-up, as opposed to an ethical principle which we need to pay attention to. And that's also why I like to draw attention to this, to find out what is a really healthy moral compass is not an easy thing. Right? It's never been easy. In a society where there's lots of moral education happening, it's probably way too rigid, and you don't actually build a compass. You just have like a list of things, and people who don't conform to the list as you see it get burned at the stake in one way or another, right? But to just say, whatever, as long as it feels good, not really a moral compass, right? So there's something in between that we're trying to figure out. So in that regard, I really love the story of Angulimala, which is very short. There's an Angulimala Sutra. So that's an official teaching of the Buddha about Angulimala. And the short version is just that Angulimala was a very kind of, what would you say, energetic being, born into a very wealthy family, had been destined that from birth there was a prediction or a prophecy that he would become a troublemaker, bandit, that type of person. His father was really afraid of that, sent him to very good teachers, etc., etc. And then he's in the assembly of this one teacher in which there's this jealousy kind of fomented, and the other students are trying to create a problem between him and the teacher, and they do that, and so the teacher gives him this false teaching. The teacher says, Angulimala, if you want to go to the highest spiritual place, you will collect a garland of 1,000 human fingers, and you will wear it around your neck. And Angulimala takes this up with great gusto, as he has taken up everything in his life, and he goes into the woods. And as he's killing these people and cutting off their finger, he turns into a kind of a demon, and he's a big problem. You can see why. Fingers. And so eventually, this is kind of a short version, but eventually the Buddha decides to intercede. And it's very interesting, I brought out this point last week, that the point in which he decides to intercede is when Angulimala's mother goes to save him, goes to say something must happen. And the Buddha hears of this, and the Buddha thinks, I cannot let Angulimala fall into this karma. He doesn't think, I'm going to save the mother from Angulimala being evil. He says, I need to save Angulimala from being evil. This is an important point. So he sees that if Angulimala kills his mother, that's way worse than the mother being killed, right? For the person who's doing the killing of their mother is a particular kind of karma. Killing in general is bad. Flavor is worse, right? So he goes to intercede. And this is where he comes upon Angulimala, and Angulimala tries to set on the Buddha to kill him and cut off his finger. And it's said that the Buddha uses a spiritual power. I'm going to come back to this in a second. And he uses a spiritual power to appear as if he is moving. He's actually just standing completely still. But the spiritual power makes it appear to Angulimala that he's moving. And Angulimala chases after him. And as fast as he can run, the Buddha is always still just a few steps in front of him. The Buddha's just walking steadily. He's not running, he doesn't change at all, just very steady. But Angulimala can never catch up. And then finally Angulimala falls to the ground. He's completely just worn out. He can't figure out why he can't catch this holy man. And he says, stop! And the Buddha turns around and he says, Angulimala, I have stopped. Now you must stop. And this becomes this kind of core teaching. I have stopped. Now you must stop. This is the Buddha's message to Angulimala. Now the spiritual power bit, you can work with in a lot of different ways, depending on how you're organized religiously, spiritually, imaginatively. But one pointer I would say is, here in this story, he's not just working in the material realm. When a spiritual power like this comes up, it's pointing at there's something happening which is difficult to see with our conventional eyes. There's something that's happening in Angulimala's experience and the Buddha's experience and their experience of each other, which is not something that you can just easily discern. And so this kind of fantastical quality invites us into that. What's happening? Where was this Buddha that Angulimala was even walking after? Probably not outside of himself. As all perceptions are not really outside of ourselves. But here we could say, in this journey, Angulimala was not an evil person by nature. There's no such thing in Buddhism. There's only delusion, which leads to evil action, which leads to the reinforcing of delusion and evil action. And so Angulimala is not cut off from having Buddha nature. Angulimala is also of the nature of Buddhahood. And he's trying to get there. But the only way he knows is to just push forward and, to destroy, to cut off fingers and put them on the garlands. He's so hungry for the next stage. He's so hungry for the truth. He's so hungry for the rightness. Right? And you can never catch the Buddha that way. So the Buddha appears, but the Buddha also has to tell a different teaching to Angulimala than the one that he's been following, so he can encounter his karma. And to encounter that karma requires stopping. Now, if we think about this legend in relationship to our own bad behavior, not that you have any bad behavior, would be impossible. Do you ever try to stop the stupid stuff you do? I highly recommend it. And you'll find pretty quickly it just doesn't work that way. Like, I'm not just in control, right? Like, what I think about of life, about behavior, about whether that's behavior of speech or of body or of thought, it's like a river is flowing. And I'm definitely, participating. My intention, sometimes I decide to do things and I do it, but it's also maybe more true to say that things are flowing through this thing that I call me, or things are flowing through and I call that flowing through me. And oftentimes something, words escape my lips that I didn't really intend on a conscious level, or I take some action, or I keep stuck in this rut that I can't seem to get out of in one way or another. Now, it's true, when we realize that, we know that we can't stop the river. Stopping is important. But if you just stop, if you just dam up the river, you can keep things stopped for a while. But pretty soon, it's going to spill over. Right? And I think we experience that when we're trying to work with our own negative behavior. Right? We do our best. Well, sometimes we don't do our best. We're doing something, we're trying to make it happen, and we can make something happen for a while, and we're holding back something, but pretty soon it's going to find a way through. And this is how karma is. The important point I want to make here, though, is damming the river is not useless. There's an important thing in that moment of stop, of where you say no, and you take the practice, the very conventional practice of saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And you force yourself to not, on whatever level you can, right? Because on that level that you can stop yourself, the water's going to start building up. And guess what you get to do when the water starts building up? Right.
Swim, drown.
Yeah, all kinds of possibilities. Right. You get to explore this water in a way that in all of its movement, you don't necessarily get to do. So now you'll notice when you're trying to stop a behavior that you're seeing as problematic, and you're like, okay, Buddha said stop, Angulimala, I have stopped, and you stop, and then you're like, oh my God, all of these feelings, all of these urges, all of these things that are like pushing me in some direction. And I don't know if you ever have this experience. Sometimes for me, it's just like, I can't believe how such a small thing can become such a big thing once I've decided not to do it. It like gets big. The dam fills up, the water's there. And so that's why this point of the spiritual powers being displayed in this story, I think, are so important. That there's something happening on another level. It's just not Angulimala chasing after the perfect being, the Buddha. But there's some internal work which is absolutely necessary. The stopping outside helps us then also pay attention to what's the stopping inside. What's the place where some contentment can be cultivated, not just control? Right? Because contentment becomes a kind of gateway to not indulging that kind of behavior. When you look into behaviors that are unskillful, usually you can find something inside it which is really not so bad. But we learn these behaviors to try to take care of that thing that don't really work very well. So damming the river can become a part of the process, or it's really, I would say, a necessary a part of a process of ethical compass development. Now, if we look at this in relationship to this work with emptiness, and we reflect this into the 5 flavors that I've been talking about, we can start seeing something happen. And I'll go through them in order, which I've been doing over and over with this, but always a reminder that these things aren't just happening in order. They're happening on a lot of layers at once, and they don't always start at the first place. Although the things that are up front usually are there because it's common that that's the place that it starts. So if you think about this first flavor of emptiness, which is it's already broken, that things come and go, things aren't even what they seem to be. When you practice this stopping, the thing's getting big, right? Because you decided not to do it. One really important quality of emptiness in that seeing is faith that it will pass. That things change. Things shift. They're not permanent. Now that causes a lot of pain in a lot of situations, but when we're facing something where we're holding on, we're practicing the stopping, and we're like, I don't know if I can not yell at this kid. For me, anger was my deep learning in a lot of this. So a lot of times my examples will be those things. But if I can stop and that feeling gets really big, that urge gets really big, that I've got to go that way, this is the only way to do it kind of thing, if I can just hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, relax, breathe, maybe remove myself from the situation as much as I can, then it will pass. And you learn that by doing it. You learn it by doing it. But sometimes it can take you to the very edge of like your marbles, right? You'll be like right on the edge, you're like, this can't be. It's so strong. Another flavor on that level is things aren't what we think they are in the first place. Like Ajahn Chah saying, the glass is already broken. Yes. So if you look into a situation, the behavior or the thing that you think is necessary probably isn't. It probably isn't even what you thought it is. And if you as you calm down a little bit, you can start to see that. You can start to see like, oh, how much energy I am to putting into this idea about how things are. Do you notice that when you really, your urges get stronger, your vision gets tighter, right? And it kind of tightens around. So on this level, we're also paying attention to, oh, this is like what I'm seeing. I'm so convinced I'm seeing how it is, but there's no such thing as seeing how it is in some kind of way that thing is that way outside of me. So then the next level is to start to see what's everything that came in to produce this situation. When we can develop some level of equanimity on that first one, like what's feeding into this? What are all of the causes and conditions that come together here? That can be a whole lifetime study, right? You studying what are these tendrils of the causes and conditions from my childhood, from my adolescence, from wherever I am in life, all of the things that have led to this moment, right? And then in the immediate time that we're right now, what's the dynamic? What's going on? What has kind of helped develop this situation in which I am feeling so compelled to this thing that I want to stop, but I don't know how? So in this level, a lot of kind of like discursive thinking can be really helpful, because this urge to just do or to turn the wheel again can be taken apart as you see that it's not just what the urge is saying it is. It's this much broader thing. So that's kind of a second level of this clear seeing. Then when we come to the third level, now in a way we're really engaging it. The first two are super important, but you see how all the ways that I'm talking about it, the behavior stays kind of over there. There's the behavior and there's you. And you're kind of holding it like, it's not what I think it is, right? It's going to come, it's going to go. It's made up of all these things that aren't just the thing that I see it as. And as you're doing that, pretty soon you're going to go, when you're really doing that first work, you're going to be inside of it. You're gonna, and it's good, and that's going to be an oh shit moment, by the way. That's not going to feel like, oh, now I'm one with it. It's going to be like, oh no, now I am overwhelmed. Now I'm in the place where I get that, like, this is completely me. I'm totally feeding it, and at the same time, I can't control it. There's nothing outside to leverage it. There's no place that I get to do, there's no place that I get to beat myself into shape. I actually have to take this different kind of responsibility. I actually have to be vulnerable. I probably actually also have to ask for help. There's all of these things which I don't want to do in my isolated self that's being protected. And this is the place where that kind of like inseparability leads to possibility, but it's not an easy step. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about that later. If we truly engage that step, or that flavor or that quality of seeing clearly, and we give up protecting our own position, then the urges, the feelings, the behaviors, the beings involved, all of those, they start becoming just what they are, as opposed to the characters in Dallas, or the days of our lives, or whatever.
Soap opera.
Soap operas, yeah. Remember Dallas? Oh, that was a little bit dated. Some of you will remember it. I just really remember that line from the Prince song. You don't have to. What is it? You don't have to watch Dallas to have an attitude.
Dynasty.
Oh, Dynasty. Have a dynasty.
Now we're all really dated.
Yeah. Now we're all very dated. Anyway, so that kind of drama that it all is, which is so compelling and is what drives so much of our behavior. There's this place where just seeing. It's like, yeah. It's just all there. And then this opportunity for a different kind of action arises in the fifth step, or in the fifth flavor, where we meet honestly. And I did say in the case of ethics, meeting honestly almost always is a form of atonement. Repentance, if you prefer the fire and brimstone twinge of that word. Right? It's a place where we cop to it. Where we're actually, not awesome. And that is so difficult to do in a very simple and clean way. It's not that all the effort to develop the moral compass is to have this very complex view of things. It's actually a simplifying process to learn to transfer the weight of living down through your feet to the ground, through your body, your physical body, your emotional body, your mental body, your spiritual body, all of whatever kind of bodies you can think of that you have. There's a gravity to living, which is just like the gravity of physical gravity. And if you haven't learned to, or in all the ways that we have definitely not learned to transfer the weight down to the ground in a skillful way, we're clumsy in how we live. So this kind of ethics, that's what it's about. And if you don't stop, it's really hard to feel like, how am I holding this weight? A lot of the time we're way out here. There's this 50-pound ball and we're way out here trying to hold it up. And we've got to get closer. We've got this simple act of being there with it allows the weight to transfer through our body. And when we feel the weight transferred down to the ground, we know, oh, it's my responsibility. Which is different than it's my fault. Right? It's my responsibility. Harmful karma is beginningless. All my past and harmful karma, born from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion. Guess what? You didn't start it. But what you call you is what was started. That's a little bit tricky linguistically. But our experience, we're definitely deluded, right? Greed, hate, and delusion. That's part of what we are. It's different than the teaching of original sin, though. It doesn't mean that we are locked out of anything. We are not fundamentally deluded or fundamentally greedy or fundamentally averse. Right? That we're actually fundamentally awake. And that is a stopped Buddha. When we try to grab that Buddha, we can't. We have to do something else. We have to stop and we have to simplify in this way so we can feel the weight. Now, I just touched on it a little bit, and I'll say a couple more things and we'll finish for today, and I'll continue next week. But this insight flavor of emptiness is a place I'd like to put a little bit of emphasis and ask you to explore. In the first two, when you can gain some composure with whatever the thing is that you want to stop. Doesn't have to be perfect composure, but you've stopped and you're like, okay, the waves of this thing come and go. It's not even really what I want. It kind of is, but I know it's not exactly. And you're right at that place and you start seeing, okay, what are all the things that play into this? And you work with those things. You can shift them around. If you struggle with alcohol, for example, having alcohol at your house, not a great circumstance, right? Pretty simple. So those kinds of things, when you're working with the causes and conditions, kind of setting those things up. And then it's at that place where you have a chance to be quiet enough that you might feel this other thing. You might feel like, oh, and then that's up to you to feel for what that is. When I oftentimes talk about my struggles with anger as a school teacher in particular, and how much ethical work it took to reorient myself in that terrain, and the place for me where this happened was when, I've heard the story many, many times, I had been working enough with it, I realized it wasn't helpful to yell at the students, but it allowed something to happen, and I'd become kind of convinced that that was the way to do things, but something was nagging, something was like, you gotta stop, and I was trying to do that, but I wasn't that successful, but I had started seeing the thing enough, just in the way I'm talking about. I started like trying to resist, feeling the compulsion get bigger, be able to feel it in my body, feel it in my heart, in my mind. And then one day, I had just unloaded on the students. And they were very quiet and compliant after that. And then as they left, one girl stayed, and her name was Grace. Beautiful young woman, she was 7th grader. And she came up to me, she said, it's not fair. And at first I thought she was saying it's not fair because some of us are doing what we're supposed to do and some of us are causing the problem and you're yelling at all of us. That's the way I heard it at first. And I was like, yeah, you're right, it's not fair. It's hard to tell who's doing what in the class. I had my list of excuses or whatever. She said, no, I don't mean that. I mean, it's not fair. It's not fair how you yell at us. And I didn't need any explanation. I knew she was right, and I needed her help to be able to see that, and something could shift in me on this sort of fundamental level. I kept yelling at the students. I didn't know how to stop. But now, the Angulimala, like hearing Buddha say, I've stopped, you stopped, I could hear that. And so when I would feel it come up in me, I would stop. And I would feel back for that place where I realized, oh, we're all in this together. My idea that I need to control you is causing harm to you and it's causing harm to me. It doesn't mean nothing needs to happen here. It does. I'm responsible for your education and for meeting you as true beings. And when I fall into this, I totally miss that point. It actually helped me realize that I really love them. Not as an excuse for the anger, but that the thing that I was trying to do that I couldn't get to, and I kept trying to chase after it and grab it and cut its finger off and put it in a garland around my neck, right? But actually what I had to do was stop. And then when I stopped, I could feel it. I could know it. I could know there's this other possibility. Now I realized that this particular story is also a particular story of it's a particular flavor. It's outward moving type of behavior inflicted on other people, relatively easy to identify among all of the various behaviors that we could have that are unskillful. This one's fairly easy to identify, so I realize it's a little bit like maybe 2nd or 3rd grade level, and a lot of our problems are like graduate school level problems. But it's a good story to illustrate what I'm talking about. And if we do those things on those levels that are less subtle, it drives us to the subtler parts of our own being, and then those finer layers of our own unskillfulness start to become apparent. And as they're apparent, it's not just a matter of, oh, how do I control myself to do the right thing? It's like, oh, guess what? It's empty, which means we're all in it together, which means there's some other way of being. How do I investigate that? So I'll go into that a little bit more next week. We have a little time for questions if there's any.
Oh, just
Hi.
Angulimala is one of my favorite stories, and I've read lots of different versions of it. And I never heard the version. There's a couple of things that are curious to me, like he's born into a wealthy family. That seems to be a sort of a recurrent theme in some of these stories. It was just like, oh, so he wasn't a bad guy to start with. But the other thing is that he, in the versions that I've read, he always has to take his karma at the end.
Oh, yeah.
He has to get, he goes into the village on alms and people throw things at him. And he's puzzled about that. Like, wait a minute, I'm a good guy now. Why are they harming me? The Buddha's like, so I just, just kind of an interesting point that, he still has to take his karma for having been bad, even though he got tricked into being bad. So you can't make any excuses about it.
Right. So that's a very good point. To me, that's one of the real gems of the total story of Angulimala, is after his conversion, he stops, he enters the renunciate community, he's very close to the Buddha and practicing, and then he gets, when he goes in for alms rounds, he gets stoned, and people are like, oh, that's Angulimala, he's horrible, and da-da-da-da-da-da, right? But when he asks the Buddha's not like, that's not, they should stop that, because you've reformed now. He's like, dude, you... What exactly do you expect? And but part of why it's kind of a fun part of the story in one way. But if you think about one way to see that part of the story is this is the evidence that Angulimala is learning how to transfer the weight down to the ground. Like atoning for something does not mean that the karmic effects of that are gone. It means that when you atone for it, you need to feel the weight down to the ground in a whole and complete way. The beginning part of the story, now there is a lot of these main characters that get pointed out and things, are coming from these wealthy families. And one way to understand that is, the kind of old school way of like who's wearing the white hat, who's wearing the black hat, and then these kind of powerful families are automatically thought to be good, and the poor families are thought to be bad. But I'm going to make excuses for that dynamic. It's definitely in there somewhere, but I don't read it quite that way. I read it more in that, like in the case of Angulimala, that he had this, he had the resources and the drive, and he still did this wacko thing, right? And so it's not so much about he was necessarily good, because there's all kinds of cases of rulers and families and things that are powerful that aren't good, and that those show up in the sutras and stories and things too. But here, with all the resources there, but he was born under a bad star. And so that's also interesting. We what star were you born under? Like, and how do you hold that? How do you think about it? So that becomes, to me, that becomes the more important, more important part. And then there are many stories of people who came from very kind of impoverished lives who were, saints. So we should, make sure to balance that.
Ojo?
Huh?
it's kind of on this one too. I was listening to a story about it also, and you kind of mentioned this, but they said that he ended up dying. He got killed, right? They killed him, right? And then, but the Buddha, when he goes to the Buddha, when he he did everything right, he's like, "What's going on?" And the Buddha said, "It's time for you to die," right? And so, like, and then when he dies, he goes to nirvana and he becomes like who he was. Is that in one of the tales too, right? And that's so great. I really love that story because it just shows that through all the stuff, and even at his death, he still had to face what he did. But he was also he also became like you would know more. He became something really.
He became important patron to pregnant women. Part of the story, he's taught by the Buddha about helping the women who are having difficult childbirth.
Giving life instead of taking it.
Yeah, exactly.
So he became.
Yeah. So now he's honored in that.
Yeah.
He's honored in that way.
Yeah. I think it's great.
I'll just say I love in that story that he has to wear himself out and be exhausted. And I've been thinking a lot recently about all the ways that I distract myself and like turn away. And it feels like it's to rest, but that actually it's wearing me out. And yet that like it's like, okay, I'm stopping. And now I'm really I'm attending to the moment, and it feels so restful, and the world is so full. Why am I trying to cut that off with something else? And it's becoming intolerable. I can't stand it. I have to turn away. And it baffles me. I mean, it just really baffles me. Like, what is it that is so unbearable about just being with what is for more than a super short period at a time?
Well put. You know, in the traditional teachings, suffering is usually talked about in 3 levels. If you're new to temple, get used to outlines. Because this is how Buddhism's organized. There were certain minds that took over the organization at a certain period in time, so that's what we are. But anyway, 3. I'm sure there's more, but the 3 that are usually talked about. Dukkha is the term for suffering. So the first dukkha is just called dukkha. And it's just like, stuff's hard. And we experience like a pain. And I would say it's not just the immediate moment of the emotional pain, but it's also the anxiousness that comes from the anticipation and the understanding that things are not stable and all that. So we have this kind of wad of discontent and angst, right? So that's dukkha. And then the next level of dukkha is really the dukkha about realizing that everything isn't what I think it is and changes all the time. So I might not have an immediate feeling of like, oh, I'm separated from something that I love, and so I miss it. That's like the first level of dukkha. The next level of dukkha is realizing, oh, that even when I'm with the person I love, I'm not even with the person who I think they are. And then they are going to come and go. And I'm going to come and go. And so that's another level of just realizing that's there. So even when I'm kind of satisfied or having a good time or things are pleasurable, there's this under current of that being there. And then the third level is just kind of the fact of ungraspability. And our mind in its ignorant state is so attuned to a fixing, to be able to know its place, that to actually rest in a way in which you are not fixing upon objects is like completely disorienting and almost nauseating, or can be nauseating, because we're so addicted to that process of nailing down. So I think this is one of the reasons that I'm, oftentimes kind of beating the Bible from the pulpit about your demon boxes. That they are perfectly set up to give you that thing. They're purposely set up to activate that reaction in you, to know who you are by the fact that there's a bing, a dong, a ding, a next thing, a whatever, an algorithm that knows how to tickle your funny bone or do whatever else. It's like, it's I mean, I used to just say demon boxes as a joke. Now I'm starting to think it's more, like more true. I have a phone, I have a computer, I use them. I'm not a Luddite. But watch yourself. You got 10 minutes, you're on the couch. You don't need to be leaving for 10 minutes to whatever's happening next. I hope you have a life in which that happens sometimes. Maybe you have a cup of tea. I dare you. Sit there. Don't do zazen. Don't meditate. Don't use a breathing technique. But nothing. Sit there. Within 10 seconds, you'll start doing this. Most of you. And then you'll be like, well, I'll read a book because that's noble. No, don't read a book. Don't read a newspaper. Nothing useful, nothing good, nothing. Just do nothing except drink your tea. And that, what you're talking about, if we don't touch back to that, there's almost a terror in there. But because we don't touch back to it, we run from it. And if you touch back to it, even if that 10 minutes is uncomfortable, I'm not saying after the 10 minutes you're going to be like, oh, I'm so glad I did that. Actually, you might. Okay, there's a possibility. But when you touch back to that, at least you're not just running from it. And it gives you a foundation or an orientation which makes something else possible. So I really recommend that. One of my teachers in Japan, Itabashi Zenji, in one of his lectures, he said this thing, I never forgot it. It was so beautiful. I'll leave you with this for your terror tea opportunity. He was talking about a lot of things, but in this one part, he said, to pour yourself a cup of tea and to just drink it alone, that itself is loneliness. To drink a cup of tea by yourself. The tea itself is loneliness. That's a gateway. That's this stopping, which we're all very afraid of.